preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Thank you. Someone asked me earlier whether this might be Wellesley Night at the Y, but I don't think so. It is, at least on this podium. Well, our speaker this evening has distinguished herself on both sides of the Atlantic as a classical scholar. And in these days of educational decline and corruption, when it seems a stunning accomplishment just to meet someone who can speak English grammar and syntax, it is rare indeed to find scholars who have dedicated themselves to the study of Greek and Latin. In the case of Professor Lefkowitz, she has excelled in a field which once was the preserve of the elites of society. Until well into the 19th century in this country, young men prepared for college by studying Latin and Greek in what were called Latin grammar schools. Young women didn't have this problem because they were excluded from the Latin grammar schools. The Boston Latin School is one of the few relics of that era that still survives, and instruction, you must know, is no longer in Latin. Entrance exams for colonial colleges consisted of reading passages in Latin and Greek. Once young men entered college at places like Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Rutgers, all instruction was conveyed in Latin, not in English. Latin was the language of educated men throughout Europe and in the North American colonies as well. A woman who could speak and read Latin was a strange anomaly indeed. Well, long after English became the language of instruction in American colleges, negative attitudes persisted towards women's education. It was considered odd or unseemly for women to study too much, and ridiculous for them to want to study the classics, which were of no use to them as future homemakers. And there was a celebrated controversy that involved two major figures in American education that bears on this evening's lecture. When the new president of Wellesley College was installed in 1899, there were quite a few college presidents who came to her inauguration, and among them was M. Carey Thomas, who was the president of Bryn Mawr. And she got into an argument with President Charles Eliot of Harvard, who was considered a leading liberal of that day and a champion of the elective system. It seems that President Eliot said in his speech on the occasion that a women's college had no guide from the past because, quote, the great tradition of learning existing from the time of the Egyptians to the present existed only for men, and that this vast body of inherited tradition was of no service in women's education, that women's colleges simply imitated men when they used the same educational methods of instead of inventing new ones of their own, and that furthermore, it would indeed be strange if women's intellects were not at least as unlike men's as their bodies. Well, M. Carey Thomas, who had earned her PhD at the University of Leipzig, summa cum laude, was outraged by Eliot's remarks. She said that President Eliot, quote, might as well have told the president of Wellesley to invent a new Christian religion for Wellesley, or new symphonies and operas, a new Beethoven and Wagner, new statues and pictures, a new Phidias and a new Titian, new tennis, a new way to swim, a new way to skate and run, new food and new drink. It would be easier to do this than to create for women a new science of geography, a new Greek tragedies, new chemistry, in short, a new intellectual heavens and earth. Well, Professor Lefkowitz is an example of a scholar who did not need to invent a new intellectual heavens and earth. She has been quite capable of conquering the same intellectual heavens and earth as the men in her field, and indeed the very same intellectual heavens and earth that President Charles Eliot of Harvard thought was beyond the reach of educated women. Mary Lefkowitz is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Wellesley College. She was born in New York City. She received her bachelor's degree at Wellesley College in 1957. She attended Brearley School in New York City, by the way. Her master's degree and PhD came from Radcliffe College. In addition to raising two daughters, both of whom also went to Wellesley, she has been a member of the faculty at Wellesley for 30 years in the Department of Greek and Latin, and she has received numerous fellowships and academic honors. Her books include The Victory Ode, Heroines and Hysterics, The Lives of the Greek Poets, and Women in Greek Myth. In addition, she has edited a collection of documents titled Women's Life in Greece and Rome, and written literally dozens of articles and reviews for journals of classical studies. She is indeed one of the leading classical scholars in the United States. Those wishing to get some personal insight into what makes this brilliant woman tick would do well to read the current Wellesley Alumni magazine, where she has written a reply to a businessman who sat next to her on a plane and said, "So you're a professor, you people have an easy life." In replying to him, I don't know what she actually said to him on the airplane, but In the article, you always think later, I should have said, and an article gives you an opportunity to say all of those things you should have said. Well, in what she should have said, she described her own heavy schedule of teaching, writing, lecturing, preparing for classes, grading papers, writing articles and books. And when friends ask her, why do you do it? Why do you keep teaching when you could make more money as an administrator or doing almost anything else? She answers, and this is what she said in the magazine article, I find the work spiritually and morally rewarding, at least most of the time. I feel that on the whole, I do much more good than harm, that I, however indirectly, help young women to realize their best potential. And she adds, when I teach or read or write, I'm never bored. These activities are almost always exciting, interesting, and best of all, educational. I like every aspect of teaching, whether it is elementary or advanced. And then when people say to her, but why do you teach classics? She replies, here I will answer simply that I believe in it. I believe that much of what it teaches about human life is true, and that the ancient Greeks understood the tragic character of human existence more accurately than the Jews or the Christians, largely because of the nature of their religion. It has helped me to understand my life, and I think it can help others. If we take it, then, that a passion for one's life's work is one of the noblest of virtues, then I present to you now a noble scholar, a noble woman, Mary Lefkowitz.
Diane, thank you very much. It's such a privilege to be introduced by somebody who has the great knowledge of education in this country that you do, and of course the history of women's education, which in part I'm going to talk about tonight, and in part this classical curriculum. Well, although in theory most university courses deal with material that concerns both male and female students, most universities now, I don't know, there's so many of us think of the universities that we attended in the way they were many years ago when we attended them. But now, most universities also have specific programs in women's studies, like American studies, peace studies, black studies, and now the much vaguer ethnic studies. The women's studies programs came into being primarily as a result of the civil rights movement in the late 60s. But even though these programs were created for political purposes, there are more subtle but nonetheless significant reasons for their continuing existence and popularity. And tonight I'm going to try and concentrate on the educational aspects of women's studies. What purpose, other than political, do their curriculums serve? Well, the answer may be none other, but let's see. Most of these programs consist of 1 or 2 survey courses, supplemented by courses about women from a variety of humanistic and social science disciplines, not necessarily or even usually offered by members of the faculty who specialize in women's studies. Thus, inevitably, the women's studies curriculum lacks the structure of scientific or linguistic disciplines where knowledge generally has to be imparted in a predictable sequence. In many cases, in these programs, the student herself, and I say herself, must determine the focus and structure of her studies within the program. Well, I speak of the concentrator in women's studies as a her, not simply to be even-handed. You're really now supposed to say him and her, or her and him all the time. But in this case, it's a her. At least in my experience, most of the majors in and takers of women's studies have been women, just as the majority of students in black studies programs are black, and presumably in ethnic studies will be ethnic. Clearly, these students want to learn about themselves and their culture. But the courses also let them feel, perhaps for the first time in their lives, that they have an advantage over the minority takers of those courses, that is, the men, simply because they are what they are by nature, female. Thus, women's studies programs allow the women to get together to discuss common interests and concerns. Sometimes they're linked with women's centers. At the very least, they provide a physical meeting place, usually somewhat informal and homey in aspect. But since women's studies programs also exist at women's colleges, like Bryn Mawr and Wellesley, They must do more than serve as meeting or rallying points for women. It may seem ironic that just when most universities in this country, and certainly in England, have become co-educational, and women have proved that they are capable of taking the same types of courses as the men, special academic programs have come into existence that seek to address the issues that seem to have been ignored by the majority, that is, the male culture. Why is it that coeducation, although it's allegedly designed for both women and men, has failed to give equal or due consideration to women's special problems, women's special interests, their needs? Why do at least some women think that they need to be educated apart from men, or to concentrate on courses about women? Because the traditional university curriculum, whatever its present undergraduate population, and whatever the fears about it a century ago when women's colleges were being founded, the traditional university curriculum was designed for men. The purpose of educating women, at least according to its first proponent, Plato, whose name is not mentioned here, I noticed, was to make women think as much like men as possible, since once women thought like men, they would be able to act in the men's and their own best interests. And according to this line of reasoning, women needed education because of the unreliability of their minds. The ancient Greeks distrusted women not, as is commonly thought, because of their sexual attributes, but because women thought like women. The prototype of the coeducational university was Plato's Academy, where a few women at least studied alongside the men. Not that anybody forgot that they were women. It's solemnly recorded, in fact, that one of these women, Lastheneia of Mantinea, was pretty and full of unaffected charm. Plato's ideas about women's education were, in many respects, more progressive than what replaced them in the first centuries CE and what's replaced them since. Nonetheless, it was not for the sake of women's own individual development that Plato and other philosophers devised the notion of educating women, but so that women could think and act more like men. For the ancient Greeks, as for us, standards were set by and for men. As in any society where cultural survival depends upon the success of a male fighting force, men ran the government, directed the finances, determined the course of their families' lives and fortunes. And since women in their society were compelled to play a subordinate role, the men assumed that their minds were as different from and inferior to men's as their bodies. Many modern scholars seem to assume that the primary reason for this is women's sexual vulnerability. A woman, as the bearer of children, would need protection, that is, restriction, so that her husband could be sure that her children were also his, since a woman, because of her sexuality, would be unfaithful and unreliable if given the opportunity. But if we listen to what the Greek men actually say, women's sexual vulnerability was not the only or even the primary explanation for men's attitudes towards women in Greek society. The men distrusted women because women's different minds were more easily influenced by emotion or immoral lines of reasoning. I'll just give you a very brief survey of some of the most notorious attacks against women in Greek literature, and this will show that men's major complaint about women is surprisingly straightforward. The women do not always want to do what is best for men. So I would argue that it makes more sense to talk about Greek philandry, that is appreciation of men, than about Greek misogyny or hatred of women, even though that's the common term that's flung at the Greeks these days. The distinction implies that Greek men did not so much hate women as distrust them, because women were different, and for that reason were not particularly sympathetic to or cognizant of women's special needs. As the men saw it, a woman ought not to have interests of her own different from those of the men in her family. And according to this definition, the archetypal good wife is Penelope in Homer's Odyssey. In the Odyssey, Agamemnon commends Penelope's good intelligence in comparison to his own wife's, Clytemnestra's, plotting of evil deeds. Now, Agamemnon, you'll remember, has good reason to hate Clytemnestra because she murdered him in order to marry her lover. He's speaking after he's dead. But then he insists that Clytemnestra will give a harsh reputation to all women in general because of her plotting of evil deeds. Women, then, are guilty until proven innocent because of their plotting, their unreliable minds. The nature of women is first defined in the myth of Pandora. According to the first author to write about her, the first woman, who was called Pandora, was created by the gods at the order of Zeus to be sent as a punishment to another god, Epimetheus, who was the brother of the god Prometheus, because Prometheus had tricked Zeus by giving fire to man. And as so often in Greek myth, as a result of a quarrel among the gods, it's the human beings who suffer. And the poet who writes about this, Hesiod, says, "Before that, the races of men had lived on earth without evils and without harsh labor and cruel diseases, which give men over to the fates. For in evil time men grow old quickly. But the woman lifted in her hands the great lid from the jar," she doesn't have a box, she has a jar, "and scattered these evils about. She devised miserable sorrows for men." In another poem, the same poet, Hesiod, whose works, like Homer's works, were studied by all educated men in antiquity, this poet says that this woman, who was created by the gods to punish Prometheus, is the ancestress of all women. From her is descended a great pain to mortal men. The race of female women who live with men and who cannot put up with harsh poverty, but only with plenty. So it is with the bees in their roofed hives who feed the drones, those conspirators in evil works. For while the bees spend the whole day until sunset making white wax, while the drones stay in their roof cells scraping together the works of others into their stomachs. So high thundering Zeus made an evil for men, women, conspirators in cruel works. And he gave men another evil to balance the good. The man who escapes marriage and the baneful works of women by preferring not to marry comes to a deadly old age for want of someone to tend him in old age. While he lives, he has plenty to eat, but when he dies, distant relatives divide up his livelihood. But for the man who has the lot of marriage and has a good wife fitted with intelligence, for him evil balances good in his lifetime. But the man who gets a wife of the wicked sort lives with undying pain in his heart, and his evil is without cure. Well, you've noticed they got the sex of bees wrong, but according to this poet, even a good wife won't allow men to regain the more prosperous life they had before Zeus sent them women. The men who get wives of the wicked sorts have an evil without a cure. So why do women, especially the bad ones, bring trouble to men? Because they're willing to share in plenty, but not in poverty. They're like drones in a beehive who do nothing and are fed by the other bees. They're useless economic liability, another mouth to feed. But in two respects, women are better than drones. A woman fitted with intelligence can help her husband, and a woman can bear a son for a man who will provide for his father when he's old, unlike the collateral heirs who will simply divide up all he's worked for. So while superficially the story of the first woman bears some resemblance to the story of Eve in Genesis, there's some significant differences. Man and woman themselves aren't responsible for their own falls. They suffer because it's the will of Zeus to punish Prometheus by afflicting humankind. And also, neither man nor woman is punished for acquiring the knowledge that enables them to distinguish between good and evil, or for becoming aware of the nature of his or her own sexuality. In the Old Testament, what makes the woman bad for man is her restlessness, her curiosity, and her willingness to listen to crafty serpents who appeal to her envious instincts. But in Hesiod, the gods themselves make women as a steep trap for man, so pretty, so full of sensual appeal, that men will not realize how evil their minds are. As Hesiod advises in his other poem, don't let a woman who shows you her bottom deceive your mind by appealing to you with flattering words and poking into your granary. A man who believes a woman believes cheats. And the poet, you see, has no moral objection to the woman displaying her bottom, but he warns his audience against believing that a woman wants a man more than the grain he has harvested. So the basic problem of female behavior is explored by another poet, a 6th century poet, Simonides, who wrote a satire on women that was probably meant to be recited at all male dinner parties. And Zeus, he explains, gave women a mind different from men's, and thus by definition unreliable. And women, he suggests, are descended from the sow, the fox, the bitch, the earth, the sea, the ass, the ferret, the mare, and the monkey. And their bad qualities include mental and moral unreliability, extravagance, laziness, and promiscuity. And he sums up with a reference to Hesiod's story of the origin of women. Zeus has contrived that these tribes of women are with men and remain with them. Yes, this is the worst plague Zeus has made, women. If they seem some use to him who has them, it's especially then that to him that they prove a plague. The man who lives with a woman never goes through all his day in cheerfulness. He will not be quick to push out of his house starvation, a housemate who is an enemy, a god who is against us. And in the next lines, he puts new emphasis on how women deceive their husbands. Yes, where there's a woman, man cannot give hearty entertainment to the guest who's come into the house, and the very woman who seems most respectable is the one who turns out guilty of the worst atrocity. He has in mind probably the most destructive example of a woman who deceived her husband, Helen of Sparta, whose elopement with her lover, Paris, was the cause of the Trojan War. So of the 10 types of women Simonides lists, only one is good, and this woman is descended from a worker bee. She's good, first of all, because she causes the man's property to grow and increase. Also, she loves her husband and family. She doesn't sit with other women when they talk about love. Unlike the other deceitful, unreliable women Simonides describes, she's not as good as she appears to be. Women like her are the best and most sensible whom Zeus bestows on men. Good sense, here, as in Hesiod's poem, is to be equated with the man's best interest. Since Greek literature provides us with many examples of women who use their intelligence to help their husbands and families, not just Penelope and Alcestis. Character claims in Lost Comedy that they're the only 2 good women, but there are others that should be familiar to you. Antigone, Andromache, Iphigenia, even Helen, according to some accounts. It's probably reasonable to assume that these extreme statements about the evil caused by women describe only the most characteristic or generic form of female behavior. In Aeschylus's drama, this is in 467 BCE, 7 against Thebes, when the enemy is at the gates of the city, the women of Thebes in panic throw themselves down before the statues of the gods, weeping and wailing, and the king, Eteocles, exclaims, "Neither in bad times nor in times of prosperity may I dwell with the race of women. When a woman wins, her boldness is unapproachable. When she's afraid, she's a greater plague to house and city." And their panic, he says, will upset the other citizens, destroy the city from within, and he tells them to leave the war to men and to stay indoors. It's the same kind of advice that Hector in the Iliad gives, though he's a bit more polite to Andromache when she urges him to fight more defensively. And the emotional unreliability is the principal target of most of the other so-called misogynistic speeches by men in Greek tragedy. When in Euripides' drama, Medea accuses Jason of having deserted her in order to marry the daughter of the king of Corinth, Jason complains that she refuses to understand how he has sensibly looked out for her and her children's best interests. He knows she sees it differently, but that's typical of the way in which women fail to use reason. You would agree with me if you weren't annoyed about our marriage. But all you women are alike in this. When your marriage goes well, you think you've got everything. But if anything goes wrong in your marriage, you turn what's best into what's most inimical. Men ought to beget children somewhere else, and there should be no female race. Another character in Greek drama who wishes that there were no female race is Hippolytus. He insists that one ought to be able to go out and buy children so that one could live in free homes without women. Hippolytus, of course, has reason to be angry. He's just learned that his stepmother, Phaedra, you're beginning to remember this plot, I think, Phaedra has fallen in love with him. And under the circumstances, we'd expect Hippolytus to complain primarily about women's infidelity to their husbands. But instead, Hippolytus first observes that women are an economic liability. The poor man struggles to buy her clothes and empties his house of wealth. And then he complains of women's mental unreliability. I hate the smart ones. I don't want a woman in my house thinking more than a woman ought to think, by which he means more than her husband would want her to think, because then he states that the smart ones have a greater ability to be unfaithful. Clytemnestra, although he doesn't mention her, would have been a good example. It never occurs to him, or to any other man making this kind of misogynistic statement, that a woman's independence of mind might on occasion be able to work for her husband's good. Women's worst qualities, costliness and duplicity, are both expressed in Hippolytus's exclamation, "Women are a bad false coin." This is double trouble. That is something outwardly good, inwardly bad, as well as a dead loss financially. So the best possible quality is not so much obedience, but what the Greeks called homonoia, same-mindedness, agreeing with one's husband about what ought to be done. According to Hippolytus, best and primary use of women is bearing children. No other qualities peculiar to the female are specifically mentioned. Hesiod implies that if it wasn't necessary to have children as companions and support in one's old age, one could simply avoid the problem of living with women. And in Euripides' dramas, Jason and Hippolytus suggest that ideally one ought to be able to produce children without resorting to women. Euripides has Hippolytus propose an arrangement where men might deposit a sum of money in a temple, each man for the amount appropriate to his estate, and buy his progeny. Presumably, since money was left in sanctuaries not only for safekeeping, but in the expectation of divine favor, a richer man might hope to buy from the god a better child, since he could leave a larger sum. Characters in dramas, particularly Euripides' dramas, often hope for, and sometimes they get, magic solutions. But though the gods do not grant Hippolytus' wish for a more rational system of reproduction, about 50 years after the Hippolytus, the drama, was performed, the philosopher Plato, in his Republic, outlined a social system that directly addresses these complaints about women's different minds and their intractable behavior. In the Republic, Socrates describes an ideal state in which it would be possible for justice to be done to everyone, or to put it in his terms, where it would be possible for everyone to do his or her own job without harming anyone else. In this state, only the people most suited to ruling would be allowed to govern, and this guardian class, remarkably, would consist of both men and women. Socrates argues that for the duties of the guardians, gender is as irrelevant a consideration as, for example, being bald or long-haired is for the practice of shoemaking. Instead, Socrates insists that some women, at least in respect to the qualities required for government, can be better than some men in certain tasks, or that, as we would say, excellence in respect to government would depend upon individual talent or lack of it, not on gender. He says, if the male or female sex appear to be superior in regard to some accomplishment or occupation, we shall say that this superiority should be credited to that sex. But if they appear to differ only in this respect, that the female sex gives birth and the male sex begets, then we shall say, it has not been shown that in regard to our discussion, a woman differs from a man, and we should think that our guardians and their wives can undertake the same tasks. In attributing to women the ability to be ruler guardians in his ideal state, Plato makes a dramatic statement about women's potential abilities, a statement that at that time had no precedent in traditional myth or history. In Plato, all tasks and responsibilities allotted to the guardians could be done by men or women, except in some unspecified cases where physical strength might be a consideration. But despite the radical nature of these proposals of Plato's, I don't think I'm ready to believe that he was concerned about women's status or in any way seriously advocating the claims and rights of women. He doesn't undertake any critique of society in his day, except by implication and in passing. Elsewhere in the Republic, he seems to accept the ordinary condescending view of women's nature, women's cowardice, lack of self-discipline, impulsiveness. Even in the section of the Republic where he presents his proposals about women's education, Socrates observes that in the practice of any particular task, men are ordinarily superior. Do you know of any human concern in which the male sex is not superior to the female? Or should we embark on a tedious discussion of weaving or pot watching or baking, which the female sex prides itself and looks most ridiculous in when bested by men? That's true, replied Glaucon, his interlocutor, who always agrees. One sex, the male, wins out over others in virtually everything, though many women are better in many respects than many men. But on the whole, it is as you say. In acknowledging that many women are better in many respects than many men, Plato isn't reflecting on political and social inequities in Athenian society, but rather trying to make a general philosophical point about the particularity of human talents, that is, the generally unexceptionable point that some people are more gifted than others, regardless of sex. So if Socrates isn't particularly sympathetic to women, why is he suggesting that they make such significant changes in their customary way of life, as he does in the Republic? And the answer, I believe, is that the reforms he proposes would help men by making women's nature more closely resemble that of men. Plato argues that in the guardian class, men and women should have the same education and responsibility because his plans for the creation and maintenance of a guardian class require the participation of superior women, primarily, though by no means exclusively, for purposes of breeding. From what he says, it appears that he's based his theories of eugenics on animal behavior. For the purposes of our argument, we decided to put these men in the position of the guards of a flock. Yes. Let's follow the argument then by giving them analogous birth and upbringing, and let's consider whether or not we should. What do you mean? Said Glaucon. As follows. Do we think that the females among guard dogs should guard along with the males in everything they undertake to guard and hunt along with them and do other things in common? Or do the females stay at home inside because they're incapable because of their childbearing and rearing, and the males do the work and have the whole responsibility of guarding the flocks? Oh, they do everything in common, except that we will treat the females as weaker and the males as stronger. Like many Socratic analogies, particularly those based on analogies with the animal world, this model doesn't work for human beings. If Glaucon had been less willing to follow along with Socrates, he might have interjected at this point. But human beings aren't like animals. For one thing, it takes longer to bear and to rear them. Nor does Glaucon object to Socrates' proposals for eugenics based on principles of producing thoroughbred animals. Among the guardians, only the best males will be encouraged to cohabit as often as possible with the best females, and the basest men will be discouraged from cohabiting with the basest women, and the offsprings of the best unions raised, and the others not, if we want the flock to be tops. Glaucon appears to think it's going to work to the advantage of women. You're talking about a great ease in childbearing for the wives of the guardians. But in fact, Plato isn't allowing Glaucon or his audience to explore the full implication of Socrates' proposals. Socrates, I'd argue, isn't making women's lives easier so much as suggesting a means whereby, as Hippolytus suggests in his tirade, that men could acquire children of appropriate value and live in houses free of the female race. In Plato's ideal society, it would be possible for men to live in houses free of women because there would be no family life as such, or marriage, but children would be produced, as we've seen, by allowing the best males to cohabit as often as possible with the best females, so as to produce the best possible offspring. The offspring judged worthy to raise would be taken from their mothers and put in the communal pen, where they would be looked after by wet nurses selected from lower classes in the society. It would also be possible in the ideal state for men to get children of appropriate value, not by putting down a sum of money, as Hippolytus had proposed, which would give an unfair advantage to the richest men who could buy the best children. Instead, Socrates proposes that from the unions of best men and best women, only the best offspring would be selected. Offspring judged to be deformed in any way would be abandoned to die, and children judged not suited to be guardians would be demoted to a lower class in the society. Socrates' proposals for women's education also appear to be designed primarily to deal with the question of women's separate mind, as Simonides put it. He insists that women share in all the same activities, including exercise, that's a particularly revolutionary proposal, formal education, and warfare. Exercise, which requires nakedness, is no longer a problem because women and men would be allowed to be selectively promiscuous. He also proposes that women have the same education as men, namely music, exercise, and the art of war. The course of training in the arts would include arithmetic, plane geometry, solid geometry, and astronomy, harmonics, and finally, dialectics. When Plato describes these studies in detail, he doesn't make any special reference to women. In fact, at the end of the discussion, Glaucon appears completely to have forgotten about the women. He exclaims, "What fine rulers we will have." And because the Greek word for ruler, archon, is specifically masculine, Plato makes sure that Socrates reminds Glaucon that the women are included, and ruleresses too, for don't think that I've said anything about men that doesn't apply to women, at least all that have the requisite natures. Seems then that the main purpose of Socrates' reforms for women is to improve the lives of men. He advocates the rights of superior women only insofar as he wishes them to have the same education and responsibilities as superior men. And even here he suggests they can only participate to the extent that their inferior physical strength permits. Although he acknowledges that the only natural distinction between the sexes concerns the bearing and begetting of children, he deals with the problem of childbearing by ignoring so far as possible its effects and consequences on female health, and he effectively abolishes the institution of motherhood. He grants to the superior females only one power specific to her sex, that of bearing the children for the good of the state. In other words, Plato deals with the problem of women's otherness by trying to make them as much like men and animals as possible. His suggestions for reform answer the questions put by the poets. How can women be prevented from acting against the best interests of the city, as they're accused of doing by Eteocles and the seven against Thebes, screaming and wailing and throwing themselves at the feet of the statues of the gods, instead of courageously standing up to the enemy when their city is surrounded? How can men ensure that women will have their husband's best interests at heart, like the good wife described by Hesiod and the bee-woman in Simonides? When Plato's contemporary Xenophon, who was another member of the circle of Socrates, discusses women's training, he also does it for the benefit of men. In his description of an ideal household in his treatise on estate management, the husband, Ischomachus, boasts to Socrates that he's got the leisure to spend his days in the agora talking to Socrates because his wife is capable of managing his estate. When she married, Ischomachus, his wife, knew only about handling wool and making clothes and about food. Socrates presses him to explain how he educated her. And Ischomachus admits it was a major undertaking that he began by offering sacrifices to the gods and prayers that I might teach and that she might learn what was best for both of us. Taking, as we might perhaps expect, his metaphor from horse training, Ischomachus explains that he began to teach his wife after she was used to his hand and domesticated, so that we could hold discussions together. The same word is hold a dialogue. And in this dialogue, the husband plays the role of Socrates, and his wife that of the interlocutor, like Glaucon, whose main role is more passive and consists mainly of assenting to whatever proposals are put forward. Ischomachus then proposes that his wife run the household. He begins by telling her that their estate will be their common possession. His wife replies that she isn't capable of assuming such responsibility. All she knows how to do is to be chaste. The answer from Ischomachus takes a lot of time in coming, is that she must be, now here comes the bee again, she must be like the queen bee in the hive. And he bases his analogy on the one female animal that can be called a ruler. Male and females are alike in self-control, diligence, memory, but men must attend to what happens outside and the women inside, since men are braver and women more fearful. Aside from this distinction, the wife will have charge of what happens within the household, like the queen bee. Ischomachus explains to his wife how the queen bee directs the making of wax and the raising of offspring, and then describes in detail how his wife should direct the household so that, like the queen bee, she will lead and others follow. Ischomachus, his wife, protests. She says, I would be amazed if the work of the leader would not pertain more to you than to me. But that's just what Ischomachus wants. Best of all, if you prove better than me and make me your servant, and you won't need to fear then that as you get older, you'll be more dishonored in the household, but instead you'll believe that you'll be more revered, since the more you become a better guardian for me and our children, the more you will be honored in our household. Her reward for assuming a man's responsibility is that she will not be thought useless when she reaches middle age, because her husband finds her less beautiful and her children are too old to need their mother. But rather she will be entitled to the kind of respect ordinarily accorded to the man of the household. In some ways, what Ischomachus says seems to resemble some of Plato's more revolutionary proposals. Ischomachus is ready to acknowledge that a woman can be better than a man in certain, though not all, respects. He wants her to assume authority and to act like a guardian. He uses the same term as Plato. But the wife is to be a guardian not for the state, but for the family and the household. And that's why the analogy of the beehive is so appropriate. The female bee who rules the hive rules over an enclosed space, and she herself, like the wife, does not go outside. And even when it comes to running the household, she is in practice only her husband's delegate, or as we might say now, co-guardian. Her husband can still come in and ask for something from his store of possessions, and she's expected to produce it or account for it. Although Ischomachus says she ought to be the captain in her household, like the captain of the guard, these are only metaphors, just like his analogy of the queen bee. And when Ischomachus advises his wife to exercise, it's within her household. It's good exercise to moisten and knead bread, and to shake out and fold cloaks and blankets. And at the end of the discussion of the wife's education, Socrates exclaims that, "You have demonstrated that your wife has a man's intelligence." As in the Republic, the improved model of a woman would think and act like a man as much as possible, though within a much more restricted sphere of operation. By proposing to make women more like men, Socrates and his followers certainly could have brought about improvements in women's status. But in fact, they didn't actually do more than discuss these proposals in the context of wider theoretical considerations. And it's certainly fair to say that in making these proposals, acting in the women's best interest wasn't their primary, it wasn't even their secondary goal. Xenophon's plans for an ideal household do not address women's problems as women might perceive them, at least to judge by some of the questions raised in tragedy, such as women's loneliness and isolation within the household, the difficulty and danger of giving birth, threats of competition from a younger concubine, fears about what will happen to their children if their husband marries again. Plato's radical proposals for restructuring society at least obviate many of the women's problems in marriage, such as competition from a younger bride or concubine. And the women guardians in his society wouldn't have either time or opportunity to be lonely in their household, since the ordinary isolation of family life would no longer exist. If the ancients were willing to accept Plato's premise that a man's education can make a woman more logical and sensible than she would be without it, why weren't they willing then to change the structure of the family and the government along the lines Plato suggested? Well, one possible reason is that Plato based his plans for human society on animal behavior without seriously addressing himself to the ways in which human beings are not like dogs or birds. Not only are human beings more long-lived, their pregnancies last longer, the process of delivery is more complicated, and since their litters are smaller, each individual birth will seem more important to them. Why wouldn't ancient women have preferred to have their own families rather than acting as impersonal broodmares for the state, bearing children every year or so for 20 years, which is what Plato proposes? So long as there was no change in the structure of society, only a very few ancient women, the wives, the sisters, the daughters of rulers, had any opportunity to see whether in practice they could assume with the men the full responsibility of waging war and of governing the state. In practice, as opposed to theory, few ancient women tried to acquire the kind of man's education that Plato or Xenophon proposed for them. In the 4th century BCE, Axiothea of Phlius was converted to Platonism by reading the Republic, and she left Arcadia for Athens dressed as a man so she could study with Plato. And the philosopher Hipparchia went about dressed in a man's cloak, breaking all the laws of proper behavior for women, and having no family life at all. But virtually all other women who had the opportunity were permitted simply to study, not to practice Platonism. Although Plutarch recommends that a husband educate his wife in order to encourage her to behave rationally, that is, less like a woman, the course of studies he recommends would also keep her from seeing her female friends. A woman will be ashamed to go dancing while she's studying geometry, and she will not be receptive to magic incantations while she's being enchanted by the discourses of Plato or Xenophon. One can't help wondering how the bride herself would have responded to Plutarch's proposed curriculum. Is dancing the antithesis of geometry? Will the discourses of Plato and Xenophon, however rational, deal with their enemies or personal problems as effectively as a magic spell? Even today, when society has begun to permit pens for young children and encourage women to work outside the home alongside men, the existence of women's studies programs and women's colleges shows that the idea of a man's education for women still hasn't won the complete approval of many women. If society has removed at least some of the obstacles to women's being co-guardians, what are the remaining problems? As we've seen, part of the trouble derives from the ancient but nonetheless persistent notion that education should make it unnecessary for women to have separate minds that work against the interests of men and thus against the society that men have organized. But it's also true that the course of studies proposed by Plato to establish his ideal society consisted almost exclusively of scientific and abstract thinking. Of what are now considered humanistic disciplines, he included only music, the most mathematical of the arts. Traditional literature, such as epic poetry, and with it the study of myth and history, was explicitly forbidden. Socrates refused to allow the guardians in his ideal state to study epic poems that, for example, showed heroes weeping. Such emotions were appropriate, he says, only for women. Although women's interest in women's studies may have begun as a manifestation of their political intentions, as their political goals are gradually, and it certainly is gradually, realized, I expect that women will continue to be drawn to women's studies, especially now that many instructors of literature and history, including now instructors of women's studies, seem more interested in theory than in texts. How else, except through the study of literature and history, will they be able to understand and appreciate the distinctive nature of women's contribution to the family and their past accomplishments? Whatever criticisms one can make of these programs, and myself, I've frequently complained about how present-day political considerations have distorted women's understanding of the past. In the end, I have some feeling that they may do more good than harm, at least if they remind educators that there's value in specific detail, in knowledge, in expression of feeling. Plato himself realized that the philosopher needed to study objects in the real world before philosophers could begin to comprehend abstractions. He also knew that fables and stories that appealed to the emotions could be more effective than theory in getting men to accept uncomfortable truths. Perhaps it's because of his skill in channeling the emotions in the service of abstract truth that Plato was read throughout antiquity and continues to be studied, despite its effort to stop a traditional curriculum today. And in the 3rd century, CE this is, the biographer Diogenes Laertius commends his patroness. He had a patroness for being an enthusiastic Platonist and for seeking out that philosopher's doctrines before anyone else's. But the book he dedicated to her isn't about philosophy. It describes the lives of the eminent philosophers, and he offers her a collection of biographical anecdotes along with summaries of major philosophers' thought. Apparently, this writer, Diogenes, believed that it would help his benefactress to know what Socrates was said to have said to Plato and about the provisions of Plato's will. Specific knowledge, even when trivial or sentimental and presented without a recognizable conceptual framework, apparently has a place in the curriculum for men as well as women.
I think I'm supposed to act the role of the interlocutor here and
Just say yes.
raise one or two questions and then pass on to you as the audience to raise questions that I haven't raised. One question that I had in listening to your talk, Mary, was that you said it would make more, and I have the advantage of having the text, which you don't have. It would make more sense to talk about Greek philandry, appreciation of men, than about Greek misogyny or hatred of women. I must say that I heard a lot of misogynistic statements. Is that inaccurate?
Well, I think they didn't hate women. It's just as they liked men better. They thought men was the better model of the two, that's all.
Well, there seemed to be a lot of discussion about how could you live without having ever to live with a woman, which sounds like not liking women a lot.
Well, that's true
The
in
race
that
of
way.
women.
But the way to deal with that, I think, was if you could convert women into junior men, and I think there's a lot of that feeling in education today, is that the best model is the male undergraduate, and a lot of the men's colleges, when they took on women, really were hoping to, the best entertainment in the afternoon, I can remember being told, was to go to the football game. And this was true for girls as well as boys in the school, and this was the idea. And therefore, the model of behavior is to watch the men play, to enjoy what men had enjoyed. And while some women might do that, some women might not, and even some men. I think that's what I was getting at, and it was just really a question of emphasis. In part, I think my hidden agenda is that people have been complaining that the Greeks are responsible for every bad thing in the world today, along with the rest of white supremacist European culture. And I'm not persuaded of this at all. And I don't think that the Greeks hated women or put down women nearly so much as a great many other societies, and that in fact their worries about women were about women's minds, and their proposals even to educate women suggested that women could be educated. And that seems to me to at least been a good start in the right direction.
That's a hopeful sign.
Yeah, one side.
Well, you also said, why do at least some women think that they need either to be educated apart from men or to concentrate on courses about women? And the answer being because the traditional university curriculum was designed for men. Can you conceive of a women's curriculum today and what it would look like? And does it exist at Wellesley or other women's colleges?
Well, that's a wonderful question. It doesn't exist at Wellesley because Wellesley, like all the great women's colleges, was designed to give women essentially the same education as men. The model for these women's colleges essentially was, I hope I'm not being disloyal in saying so, Bryn Mawr, and the work of M. Carey Thomas. Wellesley originally had a slightly more home-centered idea of a curriculum, but again, they put in those awful subjects, Latin and Greek, as well as mathematics, and the women were essentially being given a Bachelor of Arts degree equivalent to what the men would have. And so I think we haven't really had a chance to see whether women could have a separate curriculum. Now these women's studies programs come along, and they concentrate on women's histories, on women's ways of knowing, on women's ways of looking at things. There is, of course, a great deal of theory constructed about this. And even if this may eventually come up with the answer as well, maybe women's minds aren't very different from those of men at all, or different only in ways that have been conditioned by society, which is certainly the point of view most feminists would like to accept now. It may not be true, but it is what's expressed. Then I think that that's what would be the closest thing we have to a curriculum for women today. And it looks, in many respects, of course, just to be things about women, by women, and nothing beyond that.
Well,
and then you would leave out a lot that was very important to study in the rest of the world if you concentrated just on that.
You reminded me, I was reading M. Carey Thomas before I came here in preparation for introducing you, and there's another great article of hers in which she argues that if women are to be doctors or lawyers or bridge builders, they need to learn the same skills, because to cure a disease, you need to know the same thing whether you're a man or a woman. And if you're going to build a bridge, the same principles of engineering apply whether you're a man or a woman. So she, of course, argued exactly as you say, that there should be no difference in education, because otherwise there would be no equality.
Yes, and this is the principle on which everyone has been operating all this time. The thing that has been troubling me is that we still haven't really solved all the tremendous problems that were posed by the people who were worried about women's education in the 19th century, because there's still the tremendous problem of balancing careers and families, and many of the practical solutions proposed are either exhausting or very difficult or almost impractical. And it's because of that that I still am somewhat troubled, because I don't think we found the magic solution. I did think I'd found it, but I now realize I was wrong. It's just to do everything twice as hard all the time, and it does get tiring. But I think that there's another question too, and that is this desire of women to talk to other women, to find some sort of common and communal experience that exists even at women's colleges, where you'd think they'd have plenty of opportunity to do this. And I see this in part as a reaction to the tendency of college curriculums today to be so theoretical, and for the subjects of literature and history to be studied from such a theoretical point of view. That is, these people are getting back to something which is their own culture, to the understanding of themselves. And so it's a sort of very tiny little humanistic attempt to keep alive the notion of specific knowledge and specific experience as we remember it. It can, of course, cause problems of another sort, but that I want to stop talking right now.
Let me ask you one other question, then we'll go over to the audience, and that is, you say at the very end of your talk, I expect that women will continue to be drawn to women's studies, especially now that many instructors of literature and history seem more interested in theory than in text. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that they'll be drawn to it because they'll be studying something specific. They'll be going over specific lives, specific deeds. They'll be emotionally involved with the subject. And one of the problems about the Platonic curriculum as imagined by Plato, or as imagined by educators today, is that it's singularly devoid of those specific things and of emotional involvement, to become so totally objective in approaching everything. Of course, it's very hard to teach many subjects except by doing that. I can't think of a way to teach grammar too subjectively without totally ruining grammar. But I think that that's one reason that these subjects are popular. And that would also explain studies like peace studies or Black studies or ethnic studies, whatever the ethnicity is.
But let me ask you about the second half of that sentence, especially now that many instructors seem more interested in theory than in text. The theory would seem to make it less personal and more abstract.
Yes, they go into it because they're interested in the subject matter. What the instructors do with it after that, I don't know. The beginning of the movement was very much focused on recovering specific data. But now there is an attempt to elevate literature to the status of social sciences and converting literature into a kind of social science, which I find extremely boring and to read and really not very profitable. Though I think that some of the current ways of saying, well, look how you read a text, think of what assumptions you go in with, they're productive and useful. I don't ultimately think concentrating on theory is getting one anywhere. And so, in a way, I see the students, perhaps what will save us in the end, what will save higher education is students. They will really want to learn something, to know something, and will try and bring the instructors back to their senses, one hopes.
But isn't the very act of going from text to theory an abstracting? Isn't the movement from literature to social science bringing abstraction rather than the kind of personal data?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. And you certainly want to get a certain level of abstraction, so you're not just all writing down little specific things that don't connect to one another. But I think that too much of the approach in higher education today begins with abstraction without giving any of the students a chance to acquire the specific knowledge they could test it out against. So that's...
Now, if we can see, if there are any questions from the audience.
It's kind of hard to see. But.
Right down front, gentlemen.
Mary, I was interested in your reference to the Greek man's lament of the good respects of women and bond children. To what extent does the Navy advocate a solution to their problem, or a further system of Zeus's capital?
have to repeat the question.
Oh, the question was, how does the Baby M case reflect on the proposal made early on about men buying babies?
Sounds like a very good example of it, David, I think. It certainly also has economic inequities, because if you don't have a lot of money, you can't afford to do this. But I think that clearly it's a solution that hasn't met with a great deal of popular approval, has it? At this
Any other
time?
questions? Yes.
Would you say, well, I don't want to call it failure, but higher education's in trouble in the U.S. today. And would you say part of that trouble is due to over-theorizing and eliminating a lot of what's personal and specifically interesting? And how could we reverse that trend?
The question here is, do I think that in higher education today, one of the reasons that higher education is in trouble is because of the concentration on theory and theoretical approaches and getting away from specific information. And yes, I do. And I think one of the great cures would be to get back to insisting on something like E.D. Hirsch's cultural literacy, only, of course, perhaps for higher education on a more complicated and deeper scale. I've never felt there's anything wrong with knowing some specific facts. In fact, it's rather liberating. I've often felt to know the multiplication tables, for example, and not to have my calculator with me all the time. And the same thing could be said for history as well. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to get at in a rather backhanded way. There's
Yes.
one there.
Down front.
But are you saying that somehow traditionally, going back to Plato, this is that the theoretical is seen as sort of a male model of education, and that women are more detail-oriented? And then are you now recommending that maybe men get more detail-oriented too, if you haven't heard anybody?
Am I suggesting that men are more theory-oriented and that women more detail-oriented, and that education to make women more theory-oriented might be reversed and then have men become more detail-oriented? Yes, I don't think that a combination of the two would hurt anybody. And I think that Plato's very abstract curriculum, aside from, I would think, being exceptionally boring, would not be tremendously helpful for running the state or for communicating with a great many people. And to the extent that we consciously or unconsciously, and I'm sure most of it's unconsciously, emulate that, we're in trouble.
Yes, gentleman in the middle, right here. You.
You were given complete authority to do so and started a women's college. Would you have a curriculum differently than that at Wellesley?
It's a wonderful question. If I were given an authority to start a new women's college, would I have a curriculum different from that of Wellesley? I probably would in some ways. I'd probably, of course, insist on 4 years of Greek. But I think that in many ways one couldn't, because, of course, women want to enter the world and work alongside of men and do all the things that people have been doing and traditionally do. But I think that I would try to definitely bolster the teaching of specific facts of certain sorts. And this means that, yes, I would, unpopular as it is today, say that there was a basic canon of things to be known, though I wouldn't try to pin it down to only European culture. And I think I would try, yes, to have some way of talking about not only the great accomplishments of men, but some of the accomplishments of women, not, however, to give those more proportion than they probably have in what I think can rightly be judged as great progress and great ideas. That's a hard question to answer in 2 minutes.
She'll think about it and let you know later in the evening. Yes.
In your talk, Mary, you talked about
discussed any of the ramifications of her image in European history. Would you like to say anything about Sappho as an alternative model of women's education?
If you didn't hear that, that was, I didn't say anything about women's views of women and didn't mention the name of Sappho. And what about Sappho as a model for women's behavior as an alternative? And the reason I didn't do that is that I was trying to concentrate on what Plato and hence a lot of modern education was concentrating on. But one problem with knowing too much about what Sappho said is so little of her works are preserved, and so little of what we do have of her writing concentrates or says very much of anything about women's attitudes in education. She is writing, from what we mostly have, love poetry. There's a bit of one epic poem, and it's love expressed primarily for other women. In what context, it's rather hard to know. And so that's why I didn't bring that up. It would be very interesting if we had more literature by women in the ancient world. We don't have very much, and a lot of what there is written by women as professional poets who were just writing the same kind of poetry that male poets would be writing, and not really speaking then with different voices. So what little of it has been preserved, has been written about enough. And I think that when you do get a separate women's voice, they do talk about their friendships with other women and their love of place, their love of family, the things you might really expect them to have, and I think their desire very often to be able to be as strong as or to achieve what a man could achieve. This is something that comes through in just a couple of documents. And there again, that is a voice not so different from that of Plato's, but there again, one needs a whole book to answer that.
Yes, the lady in the middle back? Yes, yes, you.
I'm not sure that I would now, as long as there was some in existence. But on the other hand, I would, you have to then say, if I had the authority to found a college, and it was what I found, a women's college, if I did found one, I would certainly be on the model of the women's colleges today, which are hardly convents, and that would have the advantage of having a coeducational faculty, a truly coeducational faculty, where men took women on the faculty as seriously as women take women, and where men and women work together in an atmosphere of great equality and friendship. I think this is one of the most valuable things I've gotten out of my experience, and which I can compare to a rather different experience when I taught for a short time at Berkeley, where the women were very few and far between on the faculty and treated very differently, or so it seemed to me, from men. And that atmosphere has proven to be very good for some women, but not for all women. And one of the troubles with education in this country, I say this trembling because of the much greater experts sitting over here, is that we tend to try and make everything too homogenized and have too much of everything alike, and that the minute Harvard adopts a core curriculum, we've got to adopt a core curriculum, or the minute one university decides to become coeducational, all the others must do that, and so on. The minute we have third world studies in one place, everyone must have a third world program or feel left out. I'd like to see us try to be a little bit more independent from time to time. I think you can do that, still preparing people to have the kind of education they need for the real world.
The woman in the row just behind the one who just spoke, who had her hand up before, yes.
Part of your lecture, you had mentioned that Plato was, I guess, a maneuvering of what has now become known as the master race.
Hmm?
Was that true?
Well, except that he never went so far as to say what race. Sorry, I didn't repeat the question. From what I was saying, Plato seemed to be, in the Republic, a proponent of genetic engineering, of eugenics. And therefore, he is a precursor of the notions developed further in the 19th century, which had their most horrible culmination in Hitler and the theories proposed by Hitler, and possibly even since by other people. In some sense, he was, except that he wasn't doing it with restriction to any race or religion or any particular group. He was simply basing it on what he judged to be good and bad qualities within the human race. In general, the Greeks were not interested in any way in color prejudice, such as we have in this country today, but they believed in prejudice against people who were not Greek in general, so that there were two groups, Greeks and barbarians. But yes, he is to some extent the intellectual ancestor, but not the practical one.
Yes, this lady in white, in this white sweater.
I'm afraid that I'm a little confused because of my education. To me, specifics always meant learning math, learning science, learning specific things. You talk about specifics, and so they might be psychology or literature, understanding oneself. Now, I need a little more clarification because the terminology is different. When you say that women should be taught more specifics.
The question is, what exactly do I mean by specifics? Specific facts like the multiplication tables and so forth, very finite things, or subjects like psychology, literature, works of literature, and so on. Well, I wish I knew what I meant. That would be a great help. But I think that I would include for the university level, college level, I would try to throw in things like reading a play of Shakespeare. Don't think that every graduate of a university today has read Shakespeare, and fewer will. There are some things that one ought to know. One ought to read through whole books. And maybe one ought to know the history of some period with some facts and dates, just the way I think it would be very good for people to know geography. And I'm not the only one who says this, but I am shocked sometimes with students cannot point out where something is on a map. Not only that, they never thought to look. And we're responsible for this.
Yes, down front.
Mary, isn't part of the problem about establishing an independent curriculum for women based on the fact that their energy, even today, still goes toward equaling the curriculum, the accomplishments, the position, the income, the social security of men? Now, I happen to work in a place which has always given women equal opportunity. Ms. Richter started in 1906, and if Ms. Richter were alive today, I believe she would be shocked at so much time being spent on equal rights. She would look around and say, heavens, I've never had any difficulty getting where I wanted to get. I've never had any difficulty writing my books. What's all the hiccup that you are putting before the world today? And therefore, I think until equality is actually understood by those who obtain it, and therefore implemented in a constructive way, we will not get a specifically different curriculum for women.
Do you want to summarize the question, Mary?
Maybe you should. Well, the question, which I won't summarize well, but it wasn't a question, it was a statement. That's why it can't be summarized, is about if women are so busy trying to become equal, then why are they struggling so much when you think that in many institutions where women were, and particularly in many European institutions, and in this case the Metropolitan Museum of Art, also women were able to enter and to do the same jobs as men, why is it that women are so fussing and worrying and trying to achieve the equal things, the equal rights and equal pay and equal everything with men today? I think the problem is that in some institutions it has always been possible for women to get some sort of level of equality, but that's not been generally true. And so long as women don't have equal opportunity, they're going to want it. But that would be my take on it. Diane, do you want to
One
comment?
last question, and a quick question. Anyone have a fast question? In the center, this gentleman.
Would you spend a moment on the subject of women in Greece, especially Aphrodite, Diana, Venus? What influence?
Well, would I spend a moment on the subject of women in Greece, Aphrodite, Artemis, a few others? These, of course, are not women, they're goddesses. And goddesses have several advantages over women. Just to name the big ones, they're immortal, ageless, and powerful. And therefore, if Aphrodite wants to have a baby, dump him with some tree nymphs and then go off and go on with their career, whatever that is, she can. But mortal women can't. And Athena can remain eternally powerful as a virgin and retain her own identity because she is a virgin. But for mortal women in antiquity, being an old maid was not really on the cards. I think it was considered a very sad condition, and one that meant that you never really had any say of your own. You were always a dependent in your father's or your brother's or your nephew's household. That's briefly my comment.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.